I never thought of myself as naive. I wasn't one of those women who ignored the obvious or turned a blind eye to things just to preserve some illusion of a perfect life. But the truth is, life has a funny way of sneaking up on you, hiding cracks until they split wide open. And that's exactly what happened the day I noticed the first fracture. It started with something small, a text notification, harmless enough on the surface, but when I saw it, something in my gut twisted. The message came while we were sitting on the couch together, his phone buzzing on the armrest between us. I wasn't the snooping type, but that name, her name, lit up the screen like a flashing red sign. Margaret, my mother. I told myself not to overreact. My husband, Ryan, and my mother had always been cordial, but that was all. It wasn't unusual for him to help her with errands or home repairs. She'd been widowed for years and was always in need of a hand around the house. But the frequency of their communication had increased lately. Little things I dismissed, like the way Ryan would suddenly offer to drive over to help her fix something on weekends we'd planned to spend together. This time, though, I caught the faint flicker of guilt in his eyes when he saw me glance at his screen. He moved his phone slightly, just enough to shield it from view, and smiled like nothing was wrong. But that flicker, that brief, nervous glance, was enough to make the knot in my stomach tighten. I didn't explode right away. Instead, I stayed quiet, observing. That's something I'd learned early in life. People reveal more when you let them think you're not paying attention. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I'd overlooked before. He'd changed his cologne a month ago, said he felt like switching things up. At the time, I thought it was no big deal. Now, I wondered who he was trying to impress. His phone, always face down on the table now. Subtle but telling. Then there were his excuses. Working late had become almost routine. It all added up, and I knew what I had to do. I wasn't the type to sit back and drown in self-pity. If something was wrong, I was going to pull it out into the light, piece by piece, no matter how much it hurt. So, I waited until he was in the shower and unlocked his phone using the password I'd memorized without him realizing it. I scrolled through the messages between him and my mother. Each word burned into my brain like acid. It wasn't flirtation, it was full-blown deception. Dinner dates while I thought he was at work. Long conversations that stretched late into the night. Promises exchanged in hushed tones. I felt my pulse hammer in my ears, but I didn't cry. I didn't crumble. Instead, I thought, why her? Why my mother of all people? And more importantly, how long has this been going on right under my nose? The answers weren't in those messages, but I intended to get them. When he came out of the bathroom, towel draped over his shoulders, I was sitting calmly at the kitchen table, his phone in front of me. His smile faltered the moment our eyes met, and I could tell he knew. But I didn't scream. Not yet. I leaned forward and said the first words that came to mind. Ryan, sit down. We're going to talk about exactly what you've done. He froze, eyes darting between me and his phone like he wasn't sure if he should fight, lie, or run. I think he knew whatever excuse he gave wouldn't work this time. In that moment, I wasn't the broken wife or the blindsided fool. I was the storm he hadn't seen coming. And this was just the beginning. Ryan lowered himself into the chair across from me, his shoulders tense, his face pale. He opened his mouth like he was about to say something, probably some half-baked excuse, but I held up my hand to stop him. Don't, I said. No lies. No rehearsed speeches. You're going to tell me everything. For a few long moments, the only sound in the room was the hum of the fridge. His eyes shifted from me to the phone sitting on the table between us, like it was a ticking bomb. You read the messages, he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Of course I did. My voice was cold, but steady. I wasn't here to soften the blow for him. How long, Ryan? He rubbed a hand over his face, dragging it down like he was trying to peel away his own guilt. It started 3 months ago, he admitted. After that dinner party at her house. I felt a sick twist in my stomach. I remembered that dinner party. We'd gone over for a Sunday evening meal, just the three of us. Everything had seemed normal, except for the way Ryan had laughed a little too hard at my mother's jokes, the way she'd leaned in just a little too close. But I hadn't thought much of it then. You slept with hers? I asked bluntly. There was no point tiptoeing around it. I needed to know just how deep this betrayal went. Ryan flinched like I'd slapped him. Yes. His voice cracked on that single word, and it hit me like a punch to the chest, but I refused to let it show. Why hers? My voice didn't tremble, though I could feel the fire burning in my chest. You could have destroyed us with anyone, Ryan. Why my mother? He buried his face in his hands and let out a ragged sigh. I don't know. It just happened. I slammed my hand on the table, making him jump. Don't give me that "it just happened" garbage. That's what cowards say. You don't just trip and fall into bed with someone, especially not with your wife's mother. His eyes met mine, wide with shame and regret. She was lonely. I was stupid. Weak. She made me feel wanted. That admission stung more than anything else. Not because he felt unwanted by me, but because he was trying to use that as some sort of explanation, as if being wanted justified blowing up our lives. And what about me? I snapped. Did you think about me? About our marriage? Or did you just decide you deserved whatever attention you could get? His head hung low, and for the first time, I saw something real beneath the regret, the weight of what he'd done. I knew it was wrong, he whispered. Every second of it. And I hated myself for it. He looked up at me, eyes glassy, with unshed tears. But I didn't know how to stop. I let his words hang in the air for a moment before shaking my head. You didn't want to stop, Ryan. That's the truth. He reached across the table as if to grab my hand, but I pulled away, and the hurt in his eyes was almost satisfying. You think hating yourself makes it better? I asked. It doesn't. Not for me. You betrayed me, betrayed us. And you betrayed me with the one person in this world I should have been able to trust. Ryan swallowed hard. I'll do anything to fix this. Anything. I laughed, but there was no humor in it, just disbelief. Fix this? I repeated. You think this is something you can patch up with flowers and apologies? Ryan, this is beyond broken. I stood up, pacing the room as anger and questions swirled in my head. I thought about the times my mother had called me, pretending like nothing was wrong. I thought about the way she'd hugged me last week, telling me she was proud of me, her voice warm and steady. I felt sick to my stomach knowing how long she'd been living a double life. Have you told her I know? I asked suddenly, spinning to face him. His eyes widened in alarm. No. I haven't spoken to her since I realized. Realized what? He hesitated. Since I realized I'd ruined everything, he said, voice thick with regret. But I wasn't done. Not even close. My world had been shattered, and someone was going to answer for it. I grabbed my keys and coat without another word. Where are you going? Ryan asked, panic creeping into his voice. To get answers, I said firmly. From her. I didn't wait for his response. I was done standing still. If my mother thought she could hide behind fake smiles and carefully chosen words, she was in for a rude awakening. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I drove to my mother's house with a clenched jaw and white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. The rage in my chest was a living, breathing thing, pushing me forward. The whole way there, memories of my mother played in my head, her teaching me how to braid my hair, bringing me soup when I was sick, holding my hand during my father's funeral. And now this. Her house looked the same as always, quaint, welcoming, with the flower boxes blooming under the windows. But the sight of it made my stomach churn. I sat in the car for a moment, willing myself to stay focused. I couldn't afford to fall apart, not now. I marched up to the front door and rang the bell. A long pause. Then I heard footsteps. The door swung open, and there she was, my mother, standing there in her usual cozy sweater, a mug of tea in her hand like this was any ordinary day. Her face lit up when she saw me. Oh, sweetheart, what a surprise. I pushed past her into the house before she could finish. She blinked in shock and shut the door behind me. What's going on? She asked, concern lacing her voice. I turned to face her, crossing my arms. Don't play dumb. You know exactly what's going on. Her smile faltered, replaced by something unreadable. She set the mug down on the table with a soft clink. I don't understand. I laughed bitterly. Don't you dare. I know everything, Mom. I know about you and Ryan. Her face drained of color, and for a second, she looked like she might crumble. But she caught herself, standing straighter, gripping the edge of the table for support. Who told you? She whispered. Ryan didn't have to. Your text told me everything. I took a step closer. How could you? Her lower lip trembled, but I wasn't in the mood to watch her crumble like some tragic figure in a soap opera. I wanted answers, not tears. You're my mother. I hissed. You're supposed to protect me, not ruin my life. She covered her face with her hands, but I could still see her shoulders shaking. I never meant for this to happen, she choked out. It was a mistake. One terrible mistake. Don't call it a mistake. I snapped. You don't trip and fall into an affair. You chose this, both of you. She lowered her hands, revealing red-rimmed eyes. I was lonely, she whispered. After your father. I've been alone for so long, and I felt invisible. Ryan, he saw me. He made me feel alive again. Her words sent a jolt of disgust through me. So, you destroyed your own daughter's marriage for what? A temporary thrill? You didn't just betray me. You betrayed everything we ever had. She reached for me, but I stepped back. I didn't want her touch. Please, she begged. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you more than anything. I stared at her, searching her face for some sign of the woman I'd grown up trusting. But all I saw was someone I didn't recognize anymore, someone selfish and weak. You don't get to say that, I said, my voice cold. You don't get to talk about love after what you did. She sank into a chair, defeated. For a moment, I wondered if she expected me to comfort her, like I was supposed to be the strong one. But not this time. I hope it was worth it, I said, turning toward the door. Because you've lost me. Both of you. I left her there, sitting in stunned silence. I didn't slam the door. I closed it gently, like the final page of a story I never wanted to read in the first place. But as I stood on the porch, the weight of it all hit me. I should have felt satisfied. I confronted her, made her face what she'd done. But there was no victory in it. Just an overwhelming emptiness. The truth was out, but the fallout was only beginning. And as much as I hated to admit it, some small part of me wondered how I was supposed to rebuild anything when my entire foundation had been shattered. I didn't have the answers yet. But I knew one thing. This wasn't the end. Not yet. When I got back home, the house felt suffocating. The silence pressed down on me, thick and heavy. I dropped my keys on the counter, the clink echoing through the empty space. Ryan wasn't there. I figured he'd gone out to avoid facing me again. Good. I needed the space to think, to breathe. But instead of calming down, the anger stayed sharp, buzzing in my veins. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I wandered through the house, passing framed photos of our life together. Vacations, anniversaries, quiet Sunday mornings. All lies, now tainted by what he'd done. I reached out and took one of the pictures off the wall. It was our wedding photo. Him in his suit, grinning like he'd won the lottery. Me in my dress, so blissfully unaware of the future. Without thinking, I hurled the frame across the room. The glass shattered against the wall, raining down in tiny shards. The sound was loud and sudden, almost satisfying. But it wasn't enough. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found her number. My mother's name stared back at me. My thumb hovered over the call button for a second before I hit it. She picked up after the second ring. Hello. Her voice was shaky, unsure. I'm not done with you yet, I said. You owe me the truth. All of it. I told you everything, she whispered. No. My voice was steel. You gave me excuses. I want the truth, the whole, disgusting truth. How long were you planning on lying to me? Did you think I'd never figure it out? She exhaled shakily. I was going to end it, she said. I swear. I was trying to. But what? I cut her off. You wanted to drag it out as long as possible? Were you hoping he'd leave me? Or were you just hoping no one would ever know? There was a long pause. I wanted it to stop, she murmured. But I was too weak to stop myself. Weak. That word again, like that made any of this forgivable. I felt the same rush of disgust rise in my throat. Weakness wasn't an excuse, it was a choice. You know what the worst part is? I said. I trusted you. Both of you. I would have fought for either of you, if you'd asked me to. Instead, you both tore me apart from the inside out. She was crying now, I could hear it. I don't expect you to forgive me, she sobbed. Good, I snapped. Because I'm not there yet. I don't even know if I ever will be. I hung up before she could respond. I wasn't in the mood to listen to more apologies that didn't mean anything. Just as I set my phone down, the front door creaked open. Ryan stepped inside, eyes red-rimmed and haunted. He'd been crying good. He deserved to. We stood there in silence for a moment, staring at each other like strangers. You went to see her, didn't you? He asked, his voice hoarse. I folded my arms. Of course I did. You didn't think I'd just sit here and let the two of you spin your lies, did you? He closed his eyes and let out a shaky breath. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't mean a damn thing to me right now, Ryan. I shook my head. I don't care about your guilt. I care about why. Why her? Why throw away everything we had for someone who was supposed to be family? He pressed his hands to his face like he wanted to disappear. I don't know, he mumbled. I've asked myself that 100 times. I wish I had an answer that made sense. You wish? I laughed bitterly. That's all you have, wishes and regrets? You destroyed everything because you wanted to feel what? Younger? Powerful? What? I wasn't trying to hurt you, he whispered. But you did. My voice cracked, betraying the pain beneath my anger. You didn't just hurt me. You wrecked everything we built together. And for what? A fleeting, selfish moment. He took a step closer. I'm sorry, he repeated, like a broken record. I know that doesn't fix it, but I can't lose you. I love you, and I need you to believe that. I stared at him, wondering how love could survive something like this. How could he claim to love me when he'd betrayed me in the worst possible way? But the thing that scared me most wasn't his words. It was the tiny, traitorous part of me that still wanted to believe him. I don't know if I can do this, Ryan, I admitted, my voice low. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. He dropped to his knees in front of me, his hands trembling as he reached for mine. Please, he begged. I'll do anything. I'll spend the rest of my life proving I can be better. Just don't give up on us. I looked down at him, the man I'd once built my whole world around, now reduced to a pleading mess at my feet. The anger still burned, but underneath it, there was something else, something I didn't want to name yet. This wasn't the end. But I still wasn't sure what came next. I stepped back, forcing Ryan to let go of my hands. He stayed there on his knees, looking small and pathetic, like a man who finally realized he'd burned down his own home with himself still inside. You don't get to decide what happens next, I said quietly. I do. He nodded slowly, like a condemned man accepting his sentence. I hated that he looked so broken, it made it harder to see him as the villain he was. But he'd made this mess. And now I had to decide what to do with the wreckage. Get up, I said, waving my hand. I don't need you groveling like this. He obeyed, standing stiffly, his eyes bloodshot. You want to prove you can fix this? I asked, my voice sharp enough to cut. Yes, he croaked. Then you're going to start by telling me everything you haven't already said. I crossed my arms and stared him down. No more lies. No more half-truths. I want the ugly details, the moments you're too ashamed to say out loud. Ryan's face twisted with something between pain and fear, but he nodded. Okay, he whispered. I didn't flinch. How many times? His jaw clenched. 4. The number hit me like a slap, but I kept my face stone cold. And where's? He hesitated, but one look from me made him spill. Her house. Never here. I bit the inside of my cheek to stop myself from screaming. Of course not here. Our home, the place we'd built together, had at least been spared that violation. Small mercies, I guess. And why did it stop? I asked, leaning in. Because you suddenly grew a conscience? Or did something else happen? Ryan swallowed hard. She ended it. My eyebrows shot up. That wasn't what I expected. She ended it? I repeated slowly, like I wasn't sure I'd heard him right. He nodded. She told me she couldn't live with the guilt anymore. That she was scared of losing you. The laugh that bubbled out of me was sharp and bitter. Oh, how noble of her, I sneered. She wrecked my marriage, but drew the line at getting caught. Ryan didn't argue. He knew there was no defending her or himself. He just stood there, absorbing my words like blows. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Here's the thing, Ryan, I said. You want to save this marriage? Fine. But it's going to be on my terms. And I don't care how much it costs you. Anything, he said quickly. Whatever it takes. I studied him, weighing my options. First, I said, you're cutting off all contact with her. No excuses. No exceptions. I don't care if she's bleeding on the side of the road. You call someone else. She's dead to you. Do you understand me? Ryan's face twisted in pain, but he nodded. Yes. Second, I continued, we're not sweeping this under the rug. We're going to therapy. And I don't mean a couple of feel-good sessions where you say sorry and we hold hands. I mean you're going to sit there and own what you did, no matter how hard or humiliating it is. Okay, he whispered. And third, I hesitated, the next words catching in my throat. Third, I need time. I don't know if I'll ever forgive you, but if you want me to even try, you're going to have to live with the fact that I might not. You don't get to pressure me or rush me. I get to decide if and when you've earned any of this back. Ryan's shoulders sagged under the weight of my terms, but he didn't argue. I'll wait as long as it takes, he said softly. I stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the man I used to love. The truth was I didn't know if that man even existed anymore, or if he ever had. But for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like I was in control of something again. You better mean that, I muttered. Because if you screw this up again, Ryan, I'll burn everything down, and I'll make sure you feel every second of it. He nodded again, his eyes heavy with regret. Now get out of my way, I said, brushing past him. I need some air. I grabbed my coat and walked out the door, letting the cold night air sting my face. I wasn't sure where I was going, maybe nowhere. But for now, I needed space. I needed to figure out who I was without all the lies tangled around me. Behind me, I heard the door click shut as Ryan stayed inside alone. Good. He deserved to sit with the mess he'd made. And me? I wasn't done rebuilding yet. But one thing was for sure, I wasn't going to let anyone else write the ending of my story, but I drove aimlessly for over an hour, the hum of the tires on the road doing nothing to drown out the noise in my head. Every memory of Ryan and my mother twisted into something grotesque. I felt like I'd stepped into a nightmare that wouldn't let me wake up. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of a small lakeside park. The moon was bright, reflecting off the water's surface, but the beauty of it felt distant, unreachable. I sat there staring out at the calm lake, wondering if life could ever feel that peaceful again. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and saw my brother's name. I hesitated. I wasn't sure I was ready to tell anyone, not yet. But my thumb moved before I could stop myself. Hey, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause before he spoke. You okay? You sound off. I swallowed hard. No. I'm not okay. Is it Ryan? His voice tensed. Did he do something? I let out a bitter laugh. Oh, he did something, all right. I stared out at the water, my breath fogging up the window. It's not just him, though. It's Mom. Another silence. Then, what do you mean? I closed my eyes. She and Ryan, they had an affair. I expected disbelief or shock. Instead, I heard a sharp intake of breath, like he was trying to process something he already suspected. You knew, I whispered, my heart sinking. Didn't you? He sighed. I didn't know for sure, but I saw things that didn't sit right. Why didn't you tell me? My voice cracked, anger bubbling up again. I didn't have proof, he said quickly. And I didn't want to destroy your trust in them unless I was sure. I wanted to be furious with him, but I couldn't. This wasn't his betrayal, it was theirs. And yet his words hit me with a new kind of grief. Everyone around me saw the signs, except me. I let out a shaky breath. Well, now you know for sure. What are you going to do? He asked carefully. I don't know, I admitted. Ryan says he wants to fix things. He's begging me to give him another chance. And Mom, she's a wreck, I muttered. But she doesn't get to play the victim here. She's not a victim, he said darkly. She's selfish. She always has been, you just didn't see it because you wanted to believe she was better than that. The truth in his words stung. My mother had always been good at playing the part of the supportive, loving woman. But underneath that polished exterior, she was someone I'd never truly known. I leaned my head against the steering wheel. What do I do, Nick? He sighed. You do whatever it takes to get your peace back. Whether that means staying or walking away. It's your call. But don't do it for them. Do it for you. His words settled deep in my bones. For the first time, I realized that this wasn't just about saving a marriage or cutting ties. This was about rebuilding my life, from the ground up on my terms. I'm tired, I whispered. You've earned the right to be, he said gently. But whatever happens, I'm here. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Thanks, Nick. Anytime. We hung up, and I sat there for a while longer, letting the cold night air seep into my skin. I wasn't ready to go back to the house, but I couldn't sit in the car forever either. I finally stepped out and walked down to the water's edge, listening to the soft lapping of the waves. I thought of Ryan, alone in the house, probably torturing himself with everything he'd done. I thought of my mother, sitting in that quiet, sterile house of hers, wrapped up in her regret. But mostly I thought about myself. The woman I was before all of this. The woman I wanted to become. When I got back into the car, I knew one thing for certain. Whether or not Ryan stayed in my life, I was done living in the shadow of other people's choices. I was taking my life back. And no one was going to stop me, by the time I got home. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale, gray light over the house. I sat in the driveway for a minute, watching as the curtains in the living room shifted slightly. Ryan had probably been pacing all night, waiting for me to come back. I wasn't going to make this easy for him. When I walked in, Ryan was already standing there, disheveled, with dark circles under his eyes. The moment he saw me, he took a step forward, but I held up my hand. Don't, I warned. I'm not in the mood for more apologies. He froze, his face falling. Where did you go? He asked quietly. To clear my head, I said flatly. And to figure out what comes next. I dropped my keys on the counter and crossed my arms. We're not doing this on your timeline, Ryan. You don't get to cry and beg your way back into my good graces. You need to know exactly what you're asking me to forgive. I do, he insisted, his voice trembling. I know what I did. No, you don't, I shot back. You think this is just about the affair? It's not. It's about the fact that you betrayed me in the worst possible way, with the one person in the world who is supposed to be on my side. I took a step forward, my voice rising. You didn't just ruin our marriage. You ruined my sense of family. You turned the people I trusted most into strangers. He bowed his head, his shoulders slumping under the weight of my words. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I've made my decision, I said firmly. Ryan's head snapped up, his eyes wide. You want me to stay? I continued. Then you're going to do something for me? Anything, he whispered. You're going to write a letter to her, I said coldly. And in that letter, you're going to cut her out of your life completely. No emotional goodbyes, no justifications, just a clean break. You're going to tell her that she means nothing to you anymore, and that this is the last time you'll ever speak to her. Ryan's face paled. You want me to? Yes, I said sharply. I need you to prove that you're not still holding on to her in some corner of your heart. If you can't do that, then there's nothing left to save. He hesitated for a long, agonizing moment. I could see the internal war raging inside him. The guilt, the shame, the attachment. And for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to refuse. But then he nodded, slow and deliberate. Okay, he said, his voice hoarse. I'll do it. Good. I turned away, the conversation over in my mind. I'll be here when you're done. I didn't wait to see his reaction. I walked into the bedroom, shut the door behind me, and leaned against it, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just a test for him, it was a test for me. If he couldn't do this, I needed to be ready to walk away, no matter how much it hurt. I wouldn't stay in a life where I was second to anyone, not even to someone who was supposed to be family. An hour passed before there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find Ryan standing there, a folded piece of paper in his hand. His eyes were red, his expression haunted. He handed me the letter without a word. I unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling slightly as I read. It wasn't flowery or poetic, just a raw, brutal ending. Margaret, this is goodbye. For good. I regret every moment I let myself fall into this lie with you. You destroyed your daughter, and I destroyed her trust. There is nothing left between us. Nothing worth saving. I will never speak to you again. I'm choosing her, not you. Ryan, the words felt like a small, sharp knife cutting through the last threads of their betrayal. I looked up at him, searching his face for any trace of doubt, but all I saw was defeat and remorse. Is this what you wanted? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No, I said honestly. I wanted none of this. But at least now I know where we stand. Ryan exhaled shakily, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something real in his eyes, something that wasn't selfish or weak. I wasn't sure what forgiveness looked like yet, or if it was even possible. But as I stood there with that letter in my hand, I knew one thing. This was my story now. And whatever came next, it was my choice, not theirs. The letter was the first real thing Ryan had done to prove he was willing to tear down the world he had built with her, to burn it all for even the slightest chance of rebuilding something with me. But I wasn't about to let him off that easy. One letter didn't erase months of betrayal. I folded the paper and placed it on the dresser without looking at him. This is a start, I said. But you need to understand something. This doesn't mean you're forgiven. It doesn't mean everything is okay. I know, Ryan whispered. I don't expect it to be. I walked past him and sat on the edge of the bed, staring down at my hands. You say you love me, but do you even know what love is? Because love doesn't destroy. It doesn't lie. And it sure as hell doesn't look like what you did. Ryan sat in the chair across from me, head bowed like a man awaiting his final sentence. I've been replaying everything in my head, I continued. Every excuse, every late night, every little lie you told. You were supposed to be my partner, the one person who would never hurt me like this. And instead, I trailed off, shaking my head. You shattered everything. I know, he said again, barely audible. I closed my eyes, drawing in a deep breath. I need to know one more thing, and I need you to be honest. Were you ever planning to tell me? Ryan's face crumpled. No, he admitted. I told myself it would end, and that you'd never have to know. I thought if you didn't know, we could still be happy. A bitter laugh escaped me. Happy? You thought we could be happy while you carried around that secret? I shook my head. You didn't want to protect me. You wanted to protect yourself. You didn't confess because you were sorry. You kept it hidden because you were afraid of losing what you had. He didn't deny it. Instead, he nodded, his face pale and tired. You're right. I stood up and paced the room, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at you the same way again, I admitted. I don't know if I can ever forget the image of you and her, together. The word tasted bitter on my tongue. Ryan stood too, his voice desperate. I'll do anything. Anything to make this right. I stopped and faced him, my eyes narrowing. Then listen carefully. This is your last chance. He held his breath, waiting. You're going to give me space. Real space. Not just a few hours or a day. I need time to figure out who I am outside of this mess you've made. I pointed toward the door. You're moving out. Ryan's eyes widened. But no. I raised my hand, cutting him off. You don't get to argue. If you want me to even consider the possibility of a future with you, then you'll pack your things and leave today. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here. His shoulders sagged under the weight of my ultimatum. For a moment, I thought he might refuse, might try to plead his way out of it. But then he nodded, slow and resigned. Okay, he said quietly. If that's what you need. It is. My voice was firm, unyielding. Ryan took a shaky breath and ran a hand through his hair. I'll pack my things, he said, his voice hollow. I watched as he walked toward the closet, pulling out a duffel bag and filling it with clothes, his movements slow and mechanical. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness as I watched him. This was the man I had once believed was my forever, and now he was a stranger with a bag in his hand, carrying the wreckage of what he'd destroyed. When he was done, he paused in the doorway, looking back at me one last time. I love you, he said, his voice breaking. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I stood there, silent and immovable, as he walked out the door. The house felt different the moment he was gone, quieter, heavier. I sat on the bed and stared at the empty doorway, unsure of what came next. For the first time in months, I was alone. But I wasn't helpless. This was my life now, mine to rebuild, mine to reclaim. And whether or not Ryan ever found his way back into it, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't the same woman who had stood by blindly, trusting too easily. I was stronger now. The reckoning was over. But my healing had only just begun.